Welcome back, everybody. Last time we were here, I asked you to do some thinking. I showed you some data showing the prevalence of heart disease among men and among women at the 1956 Framingham examination. And I noticed for every age group, the prevalence of heart disease was higher for the men compared to the women. And I asked you to think about plausible, possible reasons why you might see that association. Why is it that men have higher prevalence of heart disease than women in this study? And what I'd like you to do now is to understand a few possible explanations for seeing that association. The first possible explanation is that men might be at higher risk for developing coronary heart disease. They have higher incidence. That's a topic for the next sequence of lectures that I'll be giving. But essentially what I'm saying is, let's suppose you have a population that's made up of both men and women. The top part of this box is representing the men in your study. The bottom part is the women. And in both situations, let's suppose some of these men and some of these women are developing coronary heart disease. These little arrows that I'm drawing now represent someone developing coronary heart disease. And let's suppose that more arrows are happening for men than women. More men are developing. That's what higher incidence means. More cases of heart disease are developing among the men in our study. Now, for the time being, let's suppose that all these men and all these women who develop heart disease live many years with their disease. So all the people who developed heart disease, whether it's early in the study or later in the study, are still alive when you come along with your snapshot, your Polaroid camera, to take a survey of how much heart disease there is in the study. So at one point in time, you do a little cross-sectional survey and you ask how many people have heart disease among the men, how many have heart disease among the women. Well, all the arrows that happen among the men are still alive and kicking. They're going to be answering, yes, I have heart disease. So one reason why you're seeing more heart disease among the men than among the women is this notion of being at higher incidence for developing heart disease, all other things being the same. The more disease that exists in a population, the higher the prevalence will be when you come along and take a survey of that population at one point in time. So that's one plausible explanation for men having higher prevalence. They're at higher risk for developing heart disease during the times they're being followed, during their lifetime. That's not the only explanation. Another reason might be that men live longer with their heart disease. Let's suppose we have that same population made up of men and women, but now let's suppose that the development of heart disease, the incidence of heart disease, the next topic we'll be talking about, let's suppose they're the same in both men and women, that in both the men and the women, you have the same frequency of new cases of heart disease occurring over time. But now let's suppose the men survive their heart attacks. They live through the heart attacks. So when I come along with my survey and take a picture of how much heart disease exists in that population, realize it's only being measured among people who are alive at that time. Now, if all these women developed heart disease and died soon after they developed the heart disease, when I come along with my little survey at one point in time, among the men, I'm going to pick up the cases of heart disease that developed a month ago, a year ago, 2 years ago, because those men are still alive. They have long duration of disease. But among the women, if people do not survive, if women do not survive with their heart disease, the only cases of heart disease I'm going to be picking up are those recently developed cases. The ones that developed in the past, unfortunately, have died. They're no longer alive and kicking when I come along and take my survey. So another reason you might see higher prevalence of disease in one population than another has nothing to do with the risk or the incidence of developing disease. Men and women might have the same chances of developing disease, the same likelihood of developing disease. But if men live with their disease longer, they're going to have higher prevalence. So that's a second possible explanation for why the prevalence might be higher for men than women. And unfortunately, there are even more possible explanations beyond just having higher incidence or having higher duration. In the previous session, I said that we epidemiologists measure associations, and we hope those associations represent the true causal effect of, say, a risk factor on an outcome. And I said at that time, before we can conclude that the association we see in a data represents truth, we have to exclude alternative explanations that could explain why one population has more disease than another. And I said the three possible alternative explanations were bias, confounding, or chance. It may be that men and women really do have the same prevalence of disease, but I haven't been able to measure it as carefully in both populations. Maybe in the Framingham data set, maybe men at that time saw their physicians more often. Maybe the physicians, noting that men being at high risk of disease, maybe they followed those men more carefully. Maybe they tested them more often for heart disease. So it may well be that men and women have the same amount of heart disease, the same true prevalence. But in my study, I have a measurement bias. I'm underestimating how much disease, heart disease, really exists among the women. I'm underestimating them because they haven't been tested so carefully. So what might look like the population of men having higher prevalence might just be a reflection of a measurement bias. And that's another explanation. A fourth possible explanation is that men and women have the same incidence of developing disease based on being a man or a woman, but men have other characteristics besides being a male that increases their chances of developing heart disease. Maybe men smoke more than women. Smoking brings with it higher risk of disease. So the higher prevalence we see among the men versus the women has nothing to do with their sex. It has to do with the group of men that I have in my study were mostly smokers. And the group of women I have in my study may be mostly non-smokers. So what looks like a difference in sex having on the prevalence of heart disease is really a difference in the effect of smoking on the development of heart disease. And that refers to this topic of confounding that we'll be talking about in future sessions. And then finally, Marcello's going to be talking more about the role of statistical chance. You may well have, in reality, that men and women have the same amount of heart disease if you could survey them. But what you have in your data set is a sample of all men and a sample of all women. And because of sampling variability, something he's going to be talking about, just by chance alone, you might see a higher prevalence in one group of people than another group of people, just due to the types of people who were enrolled in your study when you selected a group of men and a group of women to be in your study. So in reality, there are many plausible explanations that could explain why the prevalence is higher among men than among women in this study. And your challenge as epidemiologists is to try to rule out ones that are going to be unlikely, to come up with what you think is the most likely explanation for why there's more disease among men than among women. Now, unfortunately, there's another problem that might happen in some studies. Not this study, we're talking about men and women, but another problem with dealing with prevalence data that I'll talk about in a future session after this. But I want to leave you with one quote, which tries to drive home this problem of prevalence being influenced by both incidence, the development of new cases of disease, and prevalence, the duration of disease. A few years ago at lunchtime, I was surfing the web. I was looking at the CNN.com to see what was happening in the world that day. The reference is on the bottom of this screen. And I saw this quote. It said 1 million people, 1 million, are living with HIV in the United States at that particular time. This was in the year 2005. But the subtitle is the one that caught my attention. The statistics provides both good and bad news. Now, why is it good news that 1 million people were living with HIV in the United States in 2005? To me, that's bad news. Well, when you read the article, it went further. You could see why the subtitle said that this is both good news and bad news. The quote was that, so the first time since the height of the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s, more than 1 million Americans are believed to be living with the virus, that's the HIV, that causes AIDS, the government said on Monday. This is the quote I'd like you to go home with. The latest estimate is both good news and bad news, reflecting the success of the drugs in keeping more people alive. The duration was increasing. So when you measured the prevalence of HIV, you were catching people alive in 2005 who had contracted HIV in the previous year and also the previous years before that. People diagnosed with that virus many years in the past were still alive in 2005 to be counted in the numerator of the prevalence calculation. That's the good news. The duration was increasing. The bad news was the incidence was also still increasing. There were two reasons why the prevalence was high, more than 1 million people out that way. Higher incidence of developing the condition HIV, contracting the virus, that's the bad news, and longer duration, that's the good news. So keep that in mind whenever you're measuring prevalence data, that there are many determinants that could influence why one population might have a higher prevalence of disease than another population, and incidence and duration are those two major components I want you to keep in mind.